Okay, now let us criticize those 5 means with which people successfully managed to mitigate anarchy. First, international law. The fundamental base of international law is the equal application of it, right? In our domestic society, we have national laws, but the court or Supreme Court or other courts always apply the equally in order to make a final decisions, right? But the thing is that in international society, there's no central government. And then which institute or who makes the equal application or enforces it? Apply the final decision in reality. Well, if it doesn't work, that institution or international organization must use power or authority to make that implement. But the thing is that there's no central government. Which institute or who enforces it? Currently, which institute or who enforces it? The UN? Not really. The US does it. But the thing is that who provided that right to the United States? It's a serious question to raise. Currently, U.S. is taking the role of international police and international court. But the thing is, who provided that authority to the United States government? Second problem is that history illustrates that strong powers tend not to abide by the law. When they have their own conflicts and disputes, they go to the International Court of Justice, and obviously they don't follow or abide by the final decision made by international organizations, particularly by the International Court of Justice. And then who's going to enforce that judgment, the final decision? No one. Another problem is that when strong powers have confrontation, there's no third party to mediate them. They don't abide by the final decision made by international organizations, particularly by the International Court of Justice, and they still continue their confrontation, and there's no third party to mediate them. During the Cold War period, the US and the former Soviet Union had a severe conflicts against each other. But there was no third party or no third country to mediate them. It was the most serious problem in international law. And the similar example appears in the contemporary world, the current US-Chinese disputes. There's no third party to mediate the bilateral disputes in the contemporary world. Diplomacy. I mentioned about, when I explained the diplomacy, I mentioned about the fact that in the 20th century, diplomacy gradually lost the effectiveness or efficiency. So there's an incompatibility. In other words, they don't exist together between democracy and effectiveness of diplomacy. I explained. People wanted to know what happened. Because, in other words, the diplomacy had the most effectiveness and utility when they had secret diplomacy from 17th to 19th century. But not anymore, largely because of the 2 reasons. First, development of technologies in communication and transportation. 100 years ago, ambassadors in the meeting place do not have any technology to communicate with the government of his home country. So he had the ambassador of all rights. So, and discussed until they reach an agreement. Because of the development of technologies in communication, ambassadors make phone calls to the home countries. The transportation, it takes about a few hours to get there and come back. So probably in the middle of the negotiation, ambassadors said, let's take a break and let's meet tomorrow. And he or she takes their transportation and goes back to his own country and come back next morning. So in other words, the ambassadors do not have any full rights or full responsibilities. Or the final decisions are made from home country. Or the telephone, telegraph, or other mobile telecommunication system. Second reason is the increasing people's demand to know. Increasing people's demand to know. Particularly the sense of the taxpayers. I pay my tax, I give my money to the bureaucrats of the government, so I pay to them. So we gotta know, I must know what is going on in our government. Obviously, one of the basic principles of democracy is transparency and open to the public. So with two reasons, diplomacy is losing the effectiveness and diplomacy in the 20th century. Of course, in the 21st century too. Final question rises. In that case, if we lose the effectiveness of democracy, do we need a secret diplomacy? My answer is no, and at the same time, yes. In order to have some effectiveness of diplomacy, we might have some combination, discrete combination of openness and secrecy when we pursue a diplomatic agreement with other country. I know my statement probably provoked many critics of the other people, but I am serious about the necessary aspects of the secret diplomacy. In order to reach a very important decision, we might have open side of diplomacy and also secret side of diplomacy. Now, balance of power. The major problem of balance of power is that it's not clear whether a balance of power is source of peace or war. If power is balanced, if country A's and power and country B's power are almost equivalent, well, same. And then that situation, when power is balanced, is it a source of peace or source of war? It's hardly to tell. And also, it is very difficult to measure power. Because power has some subjective elements and also objective elements. Objective elements such as the GNP or workers' productivity, the reserve of the natural resources, something like that. Something like that, those elements we can measure and compare with other countries. But also power has the subjective elements too. Some people have some aggressiveness in history or psychological power or national cohesion, which those elements we cannot measure or we cannot compare with other countries. So it's really hard to measure power in objective terms. So how can you say power is balanced? And also the war can break out only for an equilibrium itself. So balance of power is not sure is a source of peace or war. Another problem, which is very interesting for small powers. Small powers could be sacrificed in the process of balancing power. If you look up any books or introductory books of international studies, you see these examples, Korea and Poland. Certainly, Poland was divided many times in the European continents in order for peace and stability from 17th century. And Korea was divided in the 20th century in order to make a balance of power in the Far Eastern region. So Korea between China and Japan, or Korea between the US and the Soviet Union. So Korea was divided. Poland between Germany and Russia, and Austro-Hungary and Russia, and many, many times. So Poland and Korea was sacrificed in order to make the balance of power or equilibrium in that continent, in that region. So small powers can be sacrificed in the process of making balancing of power. Collective securities. In order to make collective security system, there must be a preponderance of power. In other words, the preponderance means the superior. It's much stronger than preeminence of power, preponderance. In case of NATO versus WTO, NATO's preponderance of power over WTO provided longevity to NATO. So NATO survives so far. WTO, World Trade Organization, collapsed a long time ago. Preponderance of power. Also, in order for a collective system to survive, it requires cultural similarities. In NATO, almost all the countries share similar cultures. So numerous systems were created after World War II, such as NATO, the Baghdad Pact Treaty, and CETO, Southeast Asia, and ANZUS. But only NATO has survived. All these collective security systems demised or collapsed. Only NATO is surviving. And a question eventually rises. Why there's no NATO-like organization or collective security system in East Asia? From 1970s, many scholars and politicians of East Asia talked about making NATO-like collective security system for about decades, 2 or 3 decades. But their final answer was no. It was not possible. It's not plausible. Why? Because we do not have any cultural similarities. Particularly Japan does not have any similar culture with China or Korea. Japan obviously is not a Confucius society. Confucianism never developed in Japan. Instead, Taoism prevailed in Japan. And also, the difference between Far Eastern countries and Southeast Asian countries. When the World War II broke out, Japan invaded Korea and China, but obviously it was an invasion for Koreans and Chinese. But for the Southeast Asian people, when Japan invaded those countries were already the colonies of Western European countries. So Japan defeated Western powers, so Japanese were liberators for the Southeast Asian people. So the perception of Japan by the Far Eastern people and Southeast Asian people are fundamentally different. So we do not have any possibility to have NATO-like collective security system in East Asia. The international organizations. Obviously, the League of Nations simply did not work, simply did not prevent World War II, right? Did not work. And League of Nations recommended all the countries to dismantle or disarm. But Germany and Japan got out of renounced the League of Nations. And also the United Nations has not played any significant role of mediation since the Korean War. So we don't see any United Nations in the world conflicts. The United Nations is simply gone or dead in international conflicts. So in conclusion, although all those 5 means do not work perfectly individually to mediate anarchy, they all together have been working good for peace and stability of the international system since the end of World War II. So we successfully managed with those 5 means the negative side of anarchy in the world system.